because it is in our story where we truly find that in our DNA, that same DNA that flowed through our ancestors is here today. And that trail of tears, that forced removal, is where we find that resilience so many times.
And so as you think about your journey, about where you have been personally, not only your ancestors, not only your great-grandparents, but where you have been. And we are in the midst of a revitalization right now that is so exciting. The Trail of Tears has some very meaningful stories, but each one of you has stories.
We must amplify our historical perspective and not allow a modern removal. Sovereignty and self-determination are too valuable for future generations. However, this will require not only the strength of our tribal leaders, it will require the strength of our people.
And we know the battles and we know the scars that our ancestors felt because we feel those. And when we peel these layers back, we can find that healing. And our country, our tribes are undergoing a time of healing continuously. But today, we understand that there's so much that is out there for each of us to grasp and to take hold. And it is organizations like this that are going to be paramount to what our youth see tomorrow, so that they can have a future and pass these stories and these things along in the most relevant and the most righteous way each and every day.
We wouldn't be gathering here knowing that we've got a great Cherokee democracy. We wouldn't be here, and I couldn't be here as a chief of a nation, because our nation might not exist. But it does exist. The Cherokee people are still here. We're stronger than ever, and part of our strength is we've got great friends in the National Trail of Tears Association. Thank you all very much for your friendship and your work.
Well, like I said, Mado, Troy, and everyone for being here. It is my first time coming to this conference. Like you had mentioned before, I'm a member of the Seminole Nation. I'm of the Bear Clan, the Tom Palmer Band, and also the band chief of the Tom Palmer Band. And I'll also kind of tell you guys what our bands are in a little bit. I work for the Seminole Nation Historic Preservation Office, the cultural specialists. I do things like this, talk to many individuals from different regions, not just Oklahoma, back in Florida, Alabama, Texas, Kansas, places of our interest, where our shared history is. And then, of course, the usual NAGPRO work, TIPO jobs, things of that nature. But I'll kind of lead you guys into Seminole history. And I'll tell you guys what the bands are and a little bit about our clan systems. One thing about the Seminole Nation, people usually generalize our history along with, we kind of came around in the early 1800s, which is proven to be false. Our story began way, way before written history of the Europeans. Long before we were called Seminoles, we were called Muskogeans. And that kind of went for everybody in the Southeast. The Alabamas, the Muskogee Creeks, the Seminoles, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, they were all their own people at one point, and then as time goes on, migrations had followed. People started to take different identities and migrate to different areas. And so where my people were from Georgia and Alabama, and the whole state of Florida. My band, the Tom Palmer Band, well, we came from the Panhandle in Florida, west of Tallahassee. And so it kind of leads you guys into a little bit about the Seminole history. And like I said, we'll get to the Seminole Wars and removal, the stuff that's always heard about. But for the Seminole Nation, it's a very complex story. And the reason why I say that is how our story goes was not only because of war, It wasn't because of removal or how prosperous we were in those areas. For the Seminole people, we were probably one of the most advanced peoples down the southeast, along with the other 5 tribes and southeastern tribes. We had mastered agriculture. We had tremendous ceremonies, many languages, different dialects in the Seminole Nation. And as time goes on, living in our matrilineal societies, people like myself, the men, would spend most of our times outside the villages, protecting our borders, bringing in meat, maintaining our lands around us. And while our women would stay home and raise our children, inform our governments, and things of that nature. So now we'll get into the band structure of the Seminole Nation. My band, the Tom Palmer Band, we weren't always called the Tom Palmer Band. Our written history began a little around 1800. At first, they called us the Hostile Creeks because we were a war town. And then our chief, the band chief at that time, Pashkofa, the traditional Muskogean name, we generally took the name of our band chiefs in our band. So we went by Pashkofa, John Brown, and then Tom Palmer, and it's always been like that ever since. But in the Seminole Nation, you have 12 traditional bands and 2 freedmen bands in present day. Now I'm talking about the traditional bands. Those are the people that come from a background of Muskogean, Miccosukee, Hijiti, those kinds of tribes, even the smaller tribes that we would consider the Calusa or the Tamukwa. And so you got people that are Oconees, Hijitis, Eufaula, Miccosukee. And those are the bands that we have in the Seminole Nation. And that's why I was referred to the Seminoles as a nation. Because if you look at us as a collective, all the Seminoles, we are our own little tribes, essentially. So you have 12 different tribes that are trying to operate under one nation. Sounds like the United States, right? People with different backgrounds trying to operate under one. And so that's where that story kind of began in the early 1800s. Now, of course, we were being referred to as Seminoles as early as 1500 by the Spanish because they recognized that we were rebellious. As for our people, we were, I would say, more free. That's what they call it, Seminoles, Cimarrons, which translates into the Spanish language as runaways or rebels, things of that nature, right? And then we started becoming Seminoles around 1753 in Oconee Town, where Cowkeeper was one of the main chiefs in that area. Then we get into about around the American Revolution, and we started to see a lot of people start to migrate further away from the Creek territories in Georgia and Alabama. And so that's where we get that big mixture. Even though they did go down there in the 1800s, Seminoles had always going back and forth from Georgia to Alabama down to Florida. Because what do you got down in Florida? You have hurricane seasons, right? Now our people knew when the hurricane season was to come, so we would go up north, get higher ground, and try to get away from these storms. So we always been going to back and forth, no matter what type of professor or historian will say about the Seminoles. We had always been in that area. That was our lands. And so, as time goes on, treaties are being made with the Creeks and Seminoles. A war breaks out, the Red Stick War, and you see a big contingency of the Muskogee Creeks branch off from the Creek Nation, go down to Florida. And this is when we see the kind of the birth of what we see of the modern day Seminoles, right? So you got people that were Oconees, what we now call the Tuskegee Harjo Band. They're going down there. The head chief, Cowkeeper, he had passed away, and his nephew or his son, Micanubby, became the head chief of the Seminoles. Around 1817 is when the Seminoles declared war with the United States, all because Spain had control of Florida. And the reason why is, if we go into American history, Georgia and Alabama were already part of the United States. They already were part of the colonies way before. So they already been established. They were under American jurisdictions. Well, we have runaway slaves are coming into our territories seeking refuge. Because for the Seminoles, we didn't see skin color, we saw human beings. And so we would give refuge to people of African descent. And then so whenever these bounty hunters would cross over into Florida territories, they would come to us and they say, we're here to collect these slaves. And what we would say was, well, these are our slaves, but this is a trick that we did on them. We knew how they treated people of different skin colors. So we basically would technically lie to these bounty hunters and say, yeah, these are our slaves, even though we don't treat them like you do. So we use little code words. So that way they can have sovereignty in our areas. They don't be subjected to slavery, as how the Seminoles would. And so that kind of grew tensions down the Southeast and deep slave culture. And there's already talks about manifest destiny, moving the Indians west out into a land called Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi. So tensions were growing down in Florida, and the target was on the Seminoles. So war breaks out in 1817. They attacked a supply depot that was basically our food. And one thing you don't mess with is someone's food. And so that angered us. And so we declared war with the United States. And then so we see all these bands, ones I'm telling you about, the 12 traditional bands, they all come together and they go after one common enemy, which is the United States. No matter what clan or band, we just saw ourselves as Istijati people, Istijatis, native peoples. And we all had the same common background. We want to stay our lands. That's where our Ajulagi has stayed, the ancestors. This is where our stories began. We don't want to leave from this area. You know, you see, war isn't fun. They make it look cool in the movies. You know, if you ever see any John Wayne movie or anything that has to do with war, they make it look cool. But for us, it was a last resort. We try to be diplomatic. We didn't want to spill blood. We wanted to be peaceful. But when push came to shove, the Seminoles took every effort we did to protect ourselves, the children, the women, the elders, our land, our cultures, because we knew it was imminent. It was going to come either way. And so the Seminoles are waging war in the United States. And one of the biggest things happens in 1830. Andrew Jackson becomes president. The same year in 1830, the Indian Removal Act is passed. Even though it was unpopular all throughout the United States, a lot of people didn't agree with moving the 5 tribes west of the Mississippi because they knew the 5 tribes had aided the United States in wars before the American Revolution, War of 1812. If it wasn't for the tribes, the United States would probably be under French or Spanish or Britain rule. But it was the tribes who helped out our allies, and they turned their backs on us. And so that broke our hearts. The people that we fought for, they want to move us away from our lands, all just for a profit incentive. Down in the Southeast, those lands are perfect for farming. Cotton, tobacco, sugarcane. And that was the whole reason to move the tribes out west, because the United States was in debt from the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. So they needed a new way to bring people in for profit incentive. And they couldn't do that with the red people in the way because we didn't want to use the land for profit incentive. We had no idea of monetary value. We took what was needed and didn't drain it dry. So that's a clash of cultures. But still yet, Andrew Jackson had started moving our people out west. Two main treaties that applied to the Seminoles: the Treaty of Payne's Landing, and the big one, the Treaty of Fort Gibson. Now, the Treaty of Fort Gibson was signed at Fort King, which is now in present-day Ocala, Florida. And one of the most atrocious things about the Treaty of Fort Gibson was the Indian agent said he was corresponding with our head chiefs, and they agreed to go survey Indian territory before the treaty was signed. They didn't like it, but still the Indian agent had signed their names without them knowing. They didn't know how to read or write, so back then they would just write an X on those treaties. And that Indian agent had signed an X where their name was, without the consent of our head chiefs. The Treaty of Fort Gibson had moved the Seminoles out west. So we started to see our people being rounded up, taken to a small key island called Egmont Key. They're put in chains and shackles, all at the same time that our men are at war, fighting on different raids. And so they're putting our people in chains and shackles in decommissioned slave ships, going up the Mississippi, up the Gulf of Mexico, porting off into New Orleans at Fort Pike and Jackson Barracks, being in the most inhumane conditions of how the removal was out of the 5 tribes, because we were enemy number 1 at that time. Because mostly every single battle during the Seminole Wars, the Seminoles had won almost every battle. Even being the smallest of the 5 tribes, they couldn't defeat us because of our guerrilla warfares and just with that tenacity in our hearts, how we fought back then. The battles of Dade's Massacre, or the Dade's Battle, Battle of Lake Okeechobee, Wahoo Swamp, Loxahatchee Battle. These big battles are fought because we're trying to maintain our lives as we war. They told us in these treaties in the past they would never move us out. So in these broken treaties, we knew these treaties mean nothing to us anymore. As war wages on, we start to see these prominent figures sprout out of nowhere. People like Osceola, Yaholda, Kawakaji, Micanubby, John Jumper, Billy Bowlegs. They all stepped up to the front. And with their strategic ways of battle, we're defeating the United States every which way, taking down the Marines, the Army, the Navy. And so, as the war is waging on, they're doing essentially what the United States is doing to our people, is what we would call war crimes nowadays. They're going into these villages and burning them down and chasing children and women out of the homes, elders, put them up in chains and shackles. Sounds like slavery, right? You know, last year I went down to the Battle of Loxahatchee River, and the preservationist actually showed them to us. He said, I have about 17 of them, if you guys want to take a look at them. At first I was kind of reluctant, and I was like, well, it's kind of messed up, you know. That's not something you really want to show somebody, but then I thought about it, and it's bigger than that emotional labor. So they brought them out to us. We saw these chains and shackles that would be around our feet and our hands. And even some as small just to be fit on a toddler. And so our people are being put in these inhumane conditions, or being withheld food rations during the wars. And so how they essentially defeated us, or they tried to break us down, were these war crimes. Things that wasn't profound in that time. And how they got to our warriors was even worse. One of our most famous warriors, Osceola, as the years had gone on and his heart became heavy, and he wanted to come to a peaceful agreement. After these years of fighting, he's hearing about our people, the treatment that we're going through. So he agrees to put his rifles down and talk to General Jessup. General Jessup agrees and says, if you come down here to St. Augustine and flag a truce, we'll send you out and arrest your people as how we are to the other tribes in a more diligent matter. So Osceola goes down to St. Augustine by the orders of General Thomas Sidney Jessup. He ordered for Jose Hernandez to capture Osceola under a flag of truce. Osceola had no idea what was going on. They captured him, imprisoned him there, down in St. Augustine, and shipped him off into Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. He died a few months later, all with that broken promise. One of the most famous guys in the whole entire world. A lot of the European countries actually supported the Seminoles in our war. He was a worldwide known warrior. And so he had passed away down in Fort Moultrie. So the news comes about that one of our most prominent leaders or warriors, the top warrior in the Seminole Nation, had passed away. And it starts going down the line. One famous warrior, Kawakaji, he was told, he was actually tricked. They captured his wife and children and said, if you do not talk to these other chiefs to surrender, we're going to hang your wife and kids. So he had to endure that. He had to put his pride down, all because it was the last resort. Same thing happened to Chief Micanubby, the head chief. He was captured under flag of truce. So we started to see more Seminoles come out here into this area, Indian Territory. We're still coming up through these slave ships, being poured off to Fort Smith, Arkansas, coming up here to the Three Forks Rivers, down to Fort Gibson. My band, Tom Palmer Band, the Pashkofa Band, we came here in 1842 on a steamboat called the W.M. Gadsden. You know, my grandpa used to tell me stories about it that was passed down to him. From our band, they said, as they're sitting on these ships, looking out through the little port windows, tears fill their eyes as they're watching their homeland get further and further away. So you can feel how gut-wrenching that is, being taken away from where you are. Try to put yourself in their shoes. It sounds horrible in today's world, but back then, the treatment of the United States was not fair and just to the Seminole peoples. And so we come here to Indian Territory. A lot of our Seminoles are being out here, even though a small group of Seminoles are still at war back in Florida, being held by Billy Bowlegs, Holbutamico. He's still waging war in the United States, even though most of the population is out here in Oklahoma, near Fort Gibson. And at the time, the Seminoles are placed under the jurisdiction of the Muskogee Creek Nation. At that time, the Seminoles and the Creeks were at war with each other also. And they told us that we would have our own lands, our own sovereignty. They tried to get us to live under the Muskogee Creek jurisdiction. We had to go under their rules. And so from the first time the Seminoles come in here in 1832, we didn't get our own lands here in Indian Territory until August 7th, 1856. The area in between the two Canadian rivers, which is now present-day Seminole County, which stretched through Oklahoma City, Moore, Norman, Yukon, all the way up to Weatherford, Oklahoma. That was our land. So we were actually given that. But a lot of negotiations came about. The main chief here in Oklahoma during those negotiations was John Jumper, the nephew of Micanubby. And one thing I left out was the next person in line before John Jumper was Kawakaji. They're both the nephews of Micanubby. Kawakaji had actually become impatient. He didn't like the conditions here in Indian Territory. So he took a group of his people, and they went down to Mexico, down to Coahuila, because they couldn't stand the conditions here in Indian Territory. So a group of his people in 1849 went down there. He had passed away in 1859 down in Coahuila, Mexico. And most of his followers came back up here to Indian Territory. About 1861, same year the Civil War breaks out. The Seminoles are forced to fight on both sides. Even though our treaties, the Treaty of 1856, clearly stated we would be guaranteed no interest in an uncommon war that had nothing to do with us. Because this is the battle between the North and the South. We're our own sovereign nation, right? That's what it says in our treaties. But still yet, the Seminoles are right in the middle of these battles. My band actually tried to escape from here and go to Kansas, Fort Row, Kansas, in a Union territory where they would abide by our treaties. In 1861, a group of my band of Seminoles and Muskogee Creek Chief Obethiohola and a few other tribes were going up north. And they get caught in the crosshairs of the Texas Cavalry, which is the first Civil War battle, the Battle of Round Mountain, right? Even though we're trying to escape this, we're trying to go up to Kansas where our treaties would be honored. And so we're sucked into this battle. And they start recruiting some of our people on the South, essentially blackmailing them, telling them you have to fight for us. You can't trust the United States. We'll abide by your treaties if you fight for the Confederates. And so you got brothers fighting against brothers on the battlefield. One huge battle, the Battle of Hunting Springs, where the Seminoles are fighting there. We also have the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Muskogee Creeks. The largest Civil War battle in all of Indian Territory. We even have the first Kansas Covered Infantry coming to fight in that battle. And so as the Civil War rages on, it's later over after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so new treaties came about in 1866. 1866 comes around, and out of all the 5 tribes, the Seminoles are punished for fighting in the Civil War, even though we're forced to on both sides. The United States didn't like that some of our people fought for the Confederates, even though it wasn't our first choice. So, those lands I was telling you about in between the 2 Canadian rivers, they took those lands away and left us with a small piece, which is now present-day Seminole County. Originally, all of Oklahoma City was Muskogee Creek and Seminole lands until the 1866 treaties took those lands away. Now we take a look at Oklahoma City right now, look how prosperous it is. You take a look at present-day Seminole County. So you see how they kind of beat us down, not just spiritually, but also economically, because this is a new, different war we're fighting. So in the Reconstruction era, the Seminoles are trying to rebuild, and a new chief comes about. He fought in the Civil War, and fought in the Seminole Wars also, and came here on removal. He was nicknamed Long John because he was 6'7". His name was John Chutko. People said he could walk from Muskogee, Oklahoma down to Wovoka from sunrise to sundown. And his main goal during the Reconstruction era was every able-bodied Seminole, it was their duty to rebuild their nation. And so they did that. We started having steadfast with our tribal light horsemen, him with a few others, Thomas Little, and Okoski Miller. They're the ones who are kind of leading that charge with our light horsemen. And then years later, we see how education is starting to grow in our areas. And so the Seminoles knew our kids were going to be sent off to schools, whether we wanted to or not. But we took it upon ourselves to build our own schools. John Jumper is chief in the 1880s. And then they began discussions of building their own schools. A school, the first one, Boys Academy, Miccosukee Academy, built in 1891. Superintendent William Packard Blake was the superintendent picked by Chief John Jumper. The school was paid and bought for by the Seminole Nation. It was the only building in all the Indian Territory in 1891 that had electricity and running water, which was unheard of. A 4-story tall school structure where our kids would get an education within our own boundaries. We had to send them off to any boarding schools, out to Riverside or Chilocco, those places of that nature, right? We took it upon ourselves to educate our own. They learned arithmetic, they learned how to do chores, they learned how to raise cattle, farm. They even got to do cultural stuff. We have photographs of the kids even making Eastern longbows well after what we would say the bow and arrow culture had kind of dwindled away. We're still making those in the 1890s. Up until 1906, the kids are still making longbows. 1894 comes around, we have a second school in Mohaga, which is a girls academy. The superintendent is Alice Brown Davis. I'll tell you a little bit about her in a little bit. So we have 2 schools. If you guys have ever seen photographs of the school, if you haven't, Seminole Nation, we did a short little documentary this year on Miccosukee Academy. And if you see any of the photographs of the 2 schools, they're built both identical, which is somewhat kind of unheard of for the technology we had in the 1890s. There's only one little difference in the 2 schools and how they're built, and that's just the railings. Where Miccosukee has kind of X-cross railings and Mohaga has parallel. And that's the only difference the 2 schools have. And so the Seminole Nation has our own schools. John Jumper had passed away, and then John Brown became chief of the Seminole Nation. Around that time, talks of statehood is coming around. And then so the 5 tribes come amongst each other and talk about the state of Sequoia. The vice governor or assistant governor, which would have been the state of Sequoia, would have been John Brown. Sadly, they didn't come to fruition in 1907 before this whole area became the state of Oklahoma. Around the same time, those 2 schools I was talking about were forcibly taken away from the Seminoles. It was operated as a federal school up until 1930. They took Mohaga School and completely demolished it. They didn't pay us back any of the funds that we put into it. And they immigrated in Miccosukee and Mohaga as one school, which was Miccosukee Academy. The school shut down in 1930, and so now our kids are having to go to public schools. So you can see, like I said, over time, they're doing these little small strategic stuff to try to dwindle away our sovereignty, whether it's with warfare, economics, education. Sounds kind of similar today, right? You know, what the government's trying to do, these small little stuff, these little tactics he's trying to do. It doesn't sound like much, but if you kind of look at it, the whole list, he's still kind of going after it. And that's the same methods they've been doing for nearly 200-300 years, right? You know, as time goes on, and we're in about the 1920s, before 1969, the Seminoles, our chiefs were elected or were appointed by the President of the United States. They appointed our first female chief, Alice Brown Davis, a former superintendent of Emahog Academy. All because the president wanted a yes man. But he tried that with other chiefs before, and they wouldn't do it, they wouldn't budge. So he'd take them out and put them in, and she wouldn't budge. All because he wanted her to sign some lands away that would be in federal trust, to be taken away from the tribes, and she wouldn't budge one bit. And she stayed that way until her whole term, until she passed away in office. And as years goes on, and finally around 1969, the Seminoles are ratified their own constitution. So now we're able to elect our own peoples, our own government leaders, our chiefs, council members, while still yet operating under our traditional governmental system, which is the band system. You know, like I said, our band chiefs is one of the oldest methods of tribal government in all the world, and is still being observed today. All because of that strategic planning of us trying to exercise our sovereignty. And so now we're here in the present day. And so now we're going out here, we're trying to spread the word of what happened. And for me, I don't want to essentially want everybody to kind of be, you know, with their head down, because if you look at the emotional structure they had back then, all the stuff they had to endure in the 1800s, which I call the 1800s, the hostilities of the Seminole Nation, of removal, the Civil War, the Seminole Wars, the Dawes Commission. Even still yet, they still have their sights set on prosperity. And that's what we're trying to do today. We don't want to play victim. We're still going to come in with an iron fist and exercise the sovereignty, whether it's with economics, government, spiritualism, and that's how we are today. And that's why I'm here talking to you guys. So you can implement these words into your own teachings, whether it's your tribe or if it's your own organization, if you're nonprofit or whatever, to essentially everyone to be an ally of each other. Because if you look down to it, all the 5 tribes have that commonality, not just being Southeastern people, but we also have similar stories. But that's the end of my talk. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
Is it true that the Seminole Band of Florida never surrendered to the United States?
Yes, what he had asked was is there still a band of Seminoles down in Florida? That is correct. During the wars, some of them actually hid down the Everglades. Now, if you guys have ever seen the Everglades, you can actually understand how they actually hid down there. I went down there for the first time last year. Because I heard these stories, I was like, how they hide in these areas? Well, I went down there. You have alligators and sawgrass that's going to tear you up either which way. And so our people went deep into the Everglades and hid out there, and they never signed a formal treaty of surrendering. So if you take a look at it, the Seminoles are technically still at war with the United States. Just like the Apaches, right? Any more questions?
I have one. You mentioned the Calusa. Are any descendants of that tribe still with you?
Yes. And that question is actually kind of recent too, for a thing we've been working on with our office in the Seminole Tribe of Florida. So I believe it was last year or 2 years ago, the Smithsonian had some artifacts and human remains that they would not turn back over to the Seminoles because they were trying to say that Calusa were different from the Seminoles, that we had nothing to do with each other. And so both of us actually started talking amongst each other, and we still have some Calusa songs that are a part of our ceremonies. And so we proved the Smithsonian wrong, that these are our people, you have no rights to have it, because we still recognize that today. Even though they try to say the Timucuas or the Calusas are the ancient tribes, they still, that bloodline is still within the Seminole nations.
What is the Treaty of Fort Gibson, and when was it signed?
Treaty of Fort Gibson was signed in 1832, and I have to remember the correct dates. But that was essentially the date, or the treaty that was kind of written in stone, saying, we're giving you Seminoles 3 or 6 months to pack your things up and go west of the Mississippi. And like I mentioned before, those chiefs, the head chiefs, their names are being signed on or unwillingly knowing about that. And one cool story that's really famous with the Seminoles is the Treaty of Fort Gibson. And you can see it in a painting by the late Kelly Haney. It's a story that lives strong with us, and it's the story of Osceola stabbing the treaty. When he went up to the table and looked Thomas Sidney Jessup, or not Jessup, Wiley Thompson in the eyes, reached into his belt, pulled a knife out, and stabbed that treaty, and said, "This is how I'll sign." Because he knew that was blasphemous. He knew those chiefs didn't sign their names. So that was him essentially waging war in the United States. And that kind of story has been with our people here in Indian Territory down in Florida. And just that little story kind of gives you an insight of the mentality of the Seminoles. We're going to fight until the last of us drops, no matter what it takes. Any more questions? The Oconee came out of Georgia and Alabama, and they were close where their towns were close kind of by the Tallahassee Band, kind of nearby Fort Toulouse in those areas. They were close by the Chiaha Band also down in those areas. But the Oconees were lived fairly close to the Muskogee Creeks, even though Oconees were predominantly Hijiti speakers in their band. Now, of course, all of us spoke all the 3 languages of the Seminole Nation, but the Oconees were the Hijiti speakers in that area. And that's one of the first recorded towns in 1753. Were Cowkeeper, Bowlegs. The town was Alushwa, I believe. And that was one of the first recorded towns of the Seminoles in 1753.
How many bands are there within the nation?
In present day, we have 12 traditional bands by blood and then 2 freedom bands. And so what that means is each band has a band chief and 2 council representatives. And then of course we have our head chief and our assistant chief of the whole nation. But before then we did have more bands, and some of them had actually, some of them either just somewhat died off, or some of them had merged together with other bands and formed their own bands also. And when we see that in a lot of the histories, one famous band, one of the oldest Seminole bands, or Muskogean bands, the Thawafli Band. During the Red State Wars, they were one of the biggest war towns, and they had two branches that kind of branched off of them, which is now the Fasechi band and the Fafako band. Even though Fafako is in the Creek Nation now, they were once part of the Walthy band.
What is your total population that you have a flood plain?
So our population, I believe, last time we checked, was somewhere over 18,000 here in Seminole Nation. Now, I want to say there's about 3,500, 4,000 down in Florida, and we do have blood quantum requirements with us. And it's a little bit higher too if you want to hold a governmental position with different requirements that we have, even though a lot of us go by our band systems and also go by our clan system also.
How is your band system and clan system passed down?
Yes, our band and clan system has passed down as it has since our beginnings, our beginning stories, because we're a matrilineal society, so we got all of our identities from our mothers. And so how that worked back then was, in our clans, like so we wouldn't take our father's clan, we'd take our mother's. So we'd essentially be raised by our mother's family. And anyone that has her clan, even though that we're not related by blood, we're still related to them by clan. So we can't marry into someone that's in our own clan. We can marry outside of it. And all the different clans have different roles. Some people, some of their bands, or the clans they're supposed to be the messengers. Some are strictly just the war clans, like the Bear Clan, and the Panther, and Alligator Clan. Some are just essentially the peaceful clans, like a Wind Clan. So we all have different roles. So everyone has something to do, whether what age or what clan you come from. Well, I think that might be it. I can see they're bringing cake out right now. So I know everybody's hungry. I am too. Well, thank you everyone for your time.